Rector Schütze, Ms. Mezentseva, Ambassador Khymynets, Ambassador Brix, President Praus, dear ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to welcome you here in the great ceremonial hall of the University of Vienna. The Russian war of aggression against Ukraine is lasting for more than 2 years. It has brought immense suffering for peaceful civilians and their defenders. Despite the conflict being the bloodiest one on European soil since the end of World War II, and despite it bearing tremendous consequences for all of us, it is sometimes overshadowed in the media. Therefore, it is timely to turn an eye on the war. The exhibit being inaugurated today shows the war through the eyes of Ukrainians. It was brought to Austria by the Ukrainian-Austrian Association and is hosted by the University of Vienna. Therefore, let me first invite our host, Rector Sebastian Schütze, to the floor.
Distinguished guests, dear colleagues and students, I hope also. It is a great honor for me to welcome you all here at the University of Vienna. As Professor Mueller already mentioned, the Russian war against Ukraine has dramatically changed the geopolitical landscape of Europe, and of course not just of Europe. And as important as the first point, it has also fundamentally challenged our long-standing conviction that in the 21st century, war is not an appropriate instrument to promote political agendas. Of course, 2.5 years later, we know that this was an illusion, and we see the effects of the war in Ukraine everywhere in Europe. After a very long period of peace, the war in Ukraine is affecting, in fact, all of us, is dominating political debate and at least somehow also media coverage. I think in Austria we can say that historically and geographically in Austria we feel particularly close to the Ukrainian people, and it is certainly true for the University of Vienna. Last but not least, we have more than 1,200 Ukrainian students at University of Vienna. We have many long-standing and very intense cooperations with Ukrainian universities and other research institutions, and we have also, including Professor Mueller, many renowned experts on Ukrainian history, language, and culture. And in fact, I think it has been noted in Vienna, but also beyond Vienna, that a lot of Ukraine specialists that are interviewed in the media are indeed from the University of Vienna. So, as University of Vienna, we feel it is particularly appropriate that we host the two events we are presenting tonight. The first is we will open an exhibition which is called Eyes on War, with photographies by two renowned photographers, Konstantin and Vlada Liberov. And these are, I've just had a quick look, but they are really deeply moving images, giving the horrors of war a sort of human face. These are faces expressing desperation and fear, suffering, anger, but also resistance and hope. And I think it's very important, and probably especially for a public like in Austria that is not directly exposed to the horrors of war, to look into these faces in a way that what looks terrifying statistically speaking is actually even more terrifying when you look at individual stories that are behind those statistics. Secondly, and directly linked to the exhibition, we will have a panel with renowned experts discussing the humanitarian, legal and political aspects of the Russian war against Ukraine. And I think also in Austria it's very important to put things in a proper context and discuss them publicly with experts to be on safe grounds, because we all, I think, read too many things which are not based on facts and certainly not based on scientific research. As rector of the university, I would like to thank in the first place our Ukrainian partners to make the exhibition possible, to have brought them to the University of Vienna, and also a big thank you to Professor Wolfgang Mueller, who has been involved in this project at the University of Vienna from the very beginning and has also put together the panel for tonight. And also a big thank you to all the panelists that will discuss the issues and problems described before. The exhibition and the panel discussions are, at least from our point of view, at least a small sign of solidarity with the people of Ukraine, but we hope that it will certainly further raise the awareness among faculty, students and staff at the University of Vienna, where we certainly also hope that with the exhibition especially we will also reach a broader audience and also make other people in the public arena aware of what's really going on in Ukraine. Because that's, you know, we read numbers, we look at television services, but what's really happening there and all the traumatic experiences Ukrainians suffer, I think it's very impressive to look into the faces we will see afterwards in the exhibition. So these are things we would like to achieve with the exhibition and also with the debate afterwards. But I think this is about Ukraine, but it's also very much about Europe. We should be all aware that this war is very much about the future of Europe as well. And so I really hope that with these events we will contribute at least a little bit to the public debate and make people more aware than they might be at the moment. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you all very much for participating. And I'm looking forward to a very impressive exhibition and to our podium discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rector Schütze. Bringing the exhibit to Austria has been made possible, as has already been mentioned by Rector Schütze, with the help of Ukraine. It's a great honor now to announce the head of the Ukrainian delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, Maria Mezentseva, who will speak to us online, if the connection works. And afterwards, also Ambassador Khymynets.
I can start. Vielen Dank, liebe Kollegen. This is an extremely important evening, an event for the whole of Ukraine and for our friendship and partnership with Austrian Parliament, Austrian government, and the people of Austria. Of course, We have been cooperating for many, many years, and it's not only the history of the first brave Cossack peasants, the fighters from 18th century who brought first coffee beans to Vienna, but also longer history of cultural support and interlinked relations. This is my big honor to speak on this important topic, which indeed in these photographs of this amazing exhibition shows the terrible pain which every Ukrainian adult and child is going through. I want to thank to Austrian Parliament and of course to the delegation of the Austria in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, for the government as well, and everything we have achieved in terms of the peace formula, which President Zelensky initiated in already 22. The amount of the war crimes, according to the Prosecutor General Office and the data we are getting weekly, we're talking about 130,000 registered war crimes. And it means not only, damaged properties or unfortunately related sexual violence crime. Among victims, by the way, there are children, boys and girls, which is absolutely devastating. And this proves to us that only in unified efforts we can defeat the evil which influenced our energy system, our common food security, our daily life, our peace on the subcontinent of Europe, and affected the project which Europeans have been building for 75 years. I truly believe that only together, alles zusammen, only like this, we can defeat the highest crime, which is the crime of aggression, by establishing international tribunal for this particular crime. Because everything we're talking about in terms of war crimes daily committed by Russian army, this has a beginning. And it began with the first invasion into Ukraine in 2014, invasion into Georgia in 2008. In the 90s, this was Moldova. We don't want this list to continue. Therefore, I highly salute also the decision of the Austrian government to join the special register of the war crimes, where Ukrainians, the victims, can receive for material and non-material losses the compensations. And this is extremely important, friends, because we are all united in the understanding that Russia has to pay, not Austrian taxpayers, not French colleagues, not Germans, not Australians or Americans, but Russian funds and frozen assets should serve the purpose. Thank you very much for bringing this issue via photographs, via images of Ukrainian daily life. And thank you very much for activities of your embassy, or of course here in Kiev and elsewhere in the regions, also in my home city, Kharkiv, which itself and the region of Kharkiv is under daily shelling. That's why we call for more support for civilians. It means air defense. We know that this is not directly, let's say, an address to Austria, but for many, many allies, where Austria helps us to lobby these important issues to protect energy infrastructure, hospitals, education facilities. So finally, children in Kharkiv will come up from underground schools in metro stations and will be able to study offline. Dear friends, I'm sure today's evening will bring you a little bit closer to the emotions that we feel daily. I salute you from the capital of Kiev, where we continue to conduct our parliamentary session. I want to thank the ambassador And I want to thank, of course, to the organizers und vielen Dank für Universität and all the guests who have been gathered today. I promise to practice my German more and next time to conduct my speech in German. Noch einmal vielen Dank für alles. Sie machen für unsere Leute und für Kinder. So about children, and that would be my last red line. Thank you very much for supporting the initiative Bring Kids Back. The civilians and war prisoners who are kept since 2014 by Russia illegally is devastating. The children's stories are even more devastating. I would like to thank you for raising the voice for these 19,000 children who are kept in Russia and Belarus illegally. Thank you for supporting the initiatives to bring these children back. I'm sure the number of 500 of them who already returned back home will increase, but we should make it together with responsible organizations like UN and ICRC. Noch einmal vielen Dank. It was my big honor to speak in front of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Representative Miesenziver, for your greetings, and please forward our best wishes from Vienna to the Ukrainian capital. And now I would like to invite Ambassador Khymynets to the floor to address all of us. Ambassador Khymynets, a great friend of this country.
Magnificenz, sehr geehrter Herr Rektor Schütze, Szanowna Pani Narodny Deputat Miesenziver, sehr geehrter Herr Botschafter Brix, sehr geehrter Herr Präsident Praus, lieber Herr Professor Mueller, ich freue mich auch hier, dass mein Kollege, der österreichische Botschafter Aradbenko, auch hier ist. Dear experts, ladies and gentlemen, Szanowni Pani ta Panowie. Today, in the heart of Vienna, an unusual exhibition opens. An exhibition of photos that reflect the bitter reality of Russia's war against Ukraine. The bitter reality of a war that Ukrainians never wanted. The bitter reality of what the so-called Russian word, Ruski Mir, brings with it. This exhibition reflects the fate of Ukrainians, of people who did not want this fate for themselves. Certainly, you will see the eyes of professional military men and women. However, much more eyes you will see here are civilians, teachers and scientists, lawyers and finance professionals, engineers and analysts, IT specialists, and all others who had a completely different vision of their careers and future. Russia is trying to take away their future, our future. Russia is trying to impose its reality, the so-called Ruski Mir. A reality in which the rule of force overrides the rule of law. A reality in which justice, sustainable development, progress and prosperity are replaced by murder and violence, rape and torture, abuse of elderly and abduction of children. A reality in which comfort and everyday life are being replaced by electricity and the internet hourly as a result of rocket attacks in cities that Russia has not been able to occupy, and the destruction of entire cities that Russia was able to reach. The artists who created this exhibition, Konstantin and Vlada Liberov, wanted to truthfully and artificially portray of pain and hope of the ordinary person affected by the war. Looking at these photos, it becomes evident why Ukrainians took up arms to defend their country, to protect their future, to protect the future of their children, to stop this lawlessness and madness. Russia must be stopped and brought to justice. And the task of the entire world is to make conclusions now and prevent the future military aggression from happening again. The price of aggression must be unbearable for anyone who thinks about it. To do this, we must be united. And this unity was recently demonstrated at the Global Peace Summit in Switzerland. The Global Peace Summit is a success and the first step towards just peace. 100 states and international organizations from all continents and regions. This is true global unity. Everyone who wants a future governed by international law should follow this example and act now. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad that leading experts in the humanitarian, legal, and political fields have come together to give you more information about the many dimensions of this war, to give you the opportunity to look even deeper into the eyes of war. Look into those eyes. Don't turn away. Feel the depth of this tragedy. Russia has demonstrated that freedom and independence, as well as the rule of law, are not given in the 21st century. These are values that must be defended every day. And my message today is that everyone can contribute. Together, we can bring Russia back to respecting international law and hold it accountable for its crimes. I wish the speakers a fruitful discussion and call on visitors to share what you hear and see today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, the initiative of bringing the exhibit to Vienna came from the Ukrainian-Austrian Association. Its president, Alfred Praus, and the director of the Diplomatic Academy, Ambassador Brix, whom I invite to address us now. After the addresses, first by President Praus and then by Ambassador Brix, we will watch a 6-minute video released by the Ukrainian authorities.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege for me to have been able to bring this exhibition to Vienna. We wanted also to do it in public spaces, because who are the addressees, the target addressees of this exhibition? This is the population, and not only you who are following us here live and also in streaming, and who know to a big extent what's really happening and what it is all about. We want to spread the message. And we will see, maybe even after this exhibition, whether we will be able to show it somewhere else with even more public attendance. Let me have 2 sentences on Ukrainian-Austrian Association. It was founded in 2017 by myself under the umbrella and with the support of the late Dr. Erhard Busek, who was siding with us, with me, until one day before he passed away. I have 15 years of experience in Ukraine, because I have lived 15 years in Ukraine after my industrial career, which was international. So I'm not Ukrainian, but I know what is happening in Ukraine. I'm regular in Ukraine even now during the war. My wife is Ukrainian, my parents-in-law, they live in Odessa. I get daily first-hand information, and every month for 1 week or 10 days I'm in Ukraine, and I'm experiencing myself with my own eyes what is really happening there, and I have a lot of friends who also give me first-hand information. The Ukrainian-Austrian Association is striving to do bilateral projects in the social field and in the civil service field, in the cultural field, and also, since I'm basically a businessman, bilateral businesses between Ukraine and Austria and vice versa. In this respect, we also plan very shortly to establish a chapter in Vienna. And I'm happy that, as was already mentioned, that Ambassador Emil Brix will head the Supervisory Council of Ukrainian-Austrian Association in future in both locations, Kiev and Vienna, as successor to the late Erhard Busek. We have also an additional mission, and that is to foster the image of Ukraine in Austria. And this is not only war, this is the high level of culture, this is the beautiful country, the beautiful people, etc. But under the given circumstances, of course, we have to focus on war. I may mention that with Ambassador Emil Brix, we have done in the past year, this is already the 3rd big event. First, it was at the Diplomatic Academy in June last year with panels about civil society, about culture, and about economy and bilateral business. On the 8th of April, we have been invited by the mayor of Vienna, Michael Ludwig, at the ceremonial hall, banquet hall of Vienna City Hall. And here, we are here for the 3rd time. What is the aim of this exhibition, and behind that, what is the aim, the mission statement of Ukrainian-Austrian Association? To deliver the message that Ukraine is much more than what is normally seen in Austria by the general public. First. Second, concerning this actual war, to show what is really happening. Please consider that what you read in media and what you see in television, etc., these are excerpts or short flashlights on what is happening. So many people have died, so many people have been injured, so many attacks, etc., etc. But this does not give the real picture to you. The picture you would have, would you be on site in Ukraine? And again, as was already indicated, this is the main issue and the main reason and the main justification and purpose of this exhibition. Beyond that, it is also very important, and it will be dealt with in the panel discussion, we have also to speak about reparations, because the aggressor, as also Ambassador Khymynets has pointed out, has to pay for what they have started. According to international and supranational investigations, the damage, to repair the damage which has been done by the Russian aggression so far, it's around 500, and meanwhile even more, $500 billion. So say 500 million euro. Not to speak about the individual damages. 10 million refugees, thereof 6.5 in Ukraine, 4, maybe even 4.5 million externally, so say in Western Europe. Sorry, it's the other way around. It's 6.5 internationally and 4 to 4.5 in Ukraine. 200,000 houses, thousands of health institutions, etc., burned down, damaged, shot, destroyed, 20,000 children abducted, etc. So it is war crimes. And then it's a question of the tribunal, how to make the originators and the aggressors responsible, how to make them pay, not only money-wise, but how to convict them. So it's a question of tribunal. And last, not least, it's also a question of how to deal with the frozen assets of Russia. On one hand, Russian central bank, on the other hand, sanctions oligarchs, and this is more than 300 billion euro. And this will be covered also in the panel discussion, and I'm very, very happy that we have been able to get the General Prosecutor of Ukraine, Andriy Kostin, to deal with that later on. So let me finish with a remark about the war, in that there has been written a book by Oksana Stavrou, Russlands Krieg gegen die Ukraine, Facts and Perspectives, in German. It is here. There will be a table. You can even have a look, or you may buy this book. It's peanuts. The cost is self-cost. And I may say with quite some pride that I'm quite guilty that this book has been written, because it was more than 1 year ago that we spoke about making this exhibition. The whole thing took more than 1 year to bring it here. So it was to and fro and down and up, and was not so easy. Once on the Ukrainian side and then on the Austrian side, etc., etc. But this book was written because we said, we were sitting in a meeting with activists from Ukraine, etc., and we said, we need something more than just flashlights, 1.5 hour panels, etc., etc. And we will try, also with the help of Emil Brix, to bring this book into Oberstufe of Vienna, of Austrian gymnasiums. So Oksana Stavrou is here as well, and I'm happy that she has written it. And what you will hear here is also covered to a major extent in this book. So, thank you very much once again, and be sure this will not be the last thing we try in order to support Ukraine. Slava Ukraini, I would say in Ukraine. Thank you.
Dear Mr. Rector, dear Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, when I was phoned on the evening of the 24th of February by the predecessor of Rector Schütze from far away in the United States, I didn't know why. But he asked me only one question. What should we immediately do as University of Vienna to show our solidarity with Ukraine? And we discussed what one can do over the weekend. And the question was, can we find a flag of Ukraine somewhere? Decision was then taken that there should be a light on the main front of the university in blue and yellow. Maybe this shows you that from the very beginning here in Vienna and Austria, and especially University of Vienna, it was very clear where we stand, what our convictions are, that we are in a situation where it's not possible to be neutral. That's a position where we have to find ways to support. Let the aggressor not be successful. And we, as a diplomatic academy, we feel especially obliged to discuss with our students what's possible. And we immediately made a statement. I could read it out now here, a statement about our solidarity with Ukraine, and saying that we do understand that this is a necessary fight for the world. And our students immediately tried to help, raise some money, raise necessary means, send them out. And we organized by now more than 30 public events. The Vienna School of International Studies is not an activist place. But it looks like an activist place regarding the support of Ukraine. And I think this is right. And in these 30 events, we analyzed things. But I always had the feeling, and also in all those events which President Praus mentioned, that it is difficult to be the cool-headed analyst in such a situation. I always felt we need also to show where we morally stand. And I do very much remember, because I used to be Austrian ambassador in Moscow, so I had contacts with those people who are now responsible as war criminals for what happened. I always had the feeling, could I meet them now? Would I be able to shake hands? Would I be able to discuss in cold blood with them? And I have to admit, it would be very, very difficult for me. I do know that as a diplomat, you're supposed to shake hands with everybody. But this is a situation which, as has been expressed already, that had never taken place since the end of the Second World War. It's not just another conflict. It's about the existence of a country. It's about the main principles of international law that we have: territorial integrity, sovereignty. And it's about something which we need simply for our own self-being to support as much as we can. And with this exhibition, we would like also to remind an Austrian public that in spite of all these geopolitical issues, finding the ways towards peace, hopefully, we should not forget the faces of the victims, the faces of those who suffered and still suffer under this war. That's why I and we also support such an exhibition. Behind all this is, as I said, there are two things. One of them is, don't believe the narratives that you hear sometimes. And that's the difficulty. We try to teach it to our students. How can we really discern between the fakes and the reals? And maybe in the future, I'm hopeful, the Russian narratives about the Russian world and the Nazi and military presence in Ukraine at the moment can be a model to teach also, to discern what is a fake narrative. So fighting this Russian narrative is of highly importance. And you can do it when you show simply the real facts of what's happening at the moment in Ukraine. And this is what this exhibition is about. The rector said it very rightly: give faces to the suffering that happens at the moment in Ukraine. And the final point really is, don't let us believe that it's far away. And I'm not saying as a historian that's because the Western Ukraine used to be part of the Habsburg Empire, and we are special experts on the Western Ukraine, although I also feel an obligation because of this common history we had. But I say it because it's not just a conflict about territory in Ukraine, it's a conflict about the values. And in Austria, we tend to talk about different things. We don't talk about geopolitical values. And unfortunately, this is needed. So what we are experiencing now, and this you will not see in the exhibition, is a security challenge for the rest of Europe. And this security challenge, we have to find ways out. So that's why I think the Swiss conference on peace was very important. The talking about peace is the necessary first step. But after this, it needs a meeting, not a summit on peace, but a summit for peace. And I hope that this next meeting, wherever it will take place, will be a further step in this direction. And don't misunderstand me. There is no difference between the pictures you're going to see here of suffering and the fight that we have to do for a sustainable and fair peace in and for Ukraine. And in this we are all together. I think Ambassador Khymynets knows it very well, that in Austria there is no second opinion really where Austria stands. And whoever tries to give you a different view on this, please answer. And again, this was said already by Ambassador Khymynets. Everybody can do something, contribute something to this, in whatever capacity you are active. So my plea is, do it. Because in diplomacy we say, if you are not at the table, you are on the table. And I mean it. It's about Europe, the free world, and the fate of an independent and sovereign Ukraine. So, Slava Ukraine.
Ladies and gentlemen, after these images, we will have a very short break of 3 minutes for arranging the floor for the panel discussion. For technical reasons, we will postpone the joint visit to the exhibit until after the panel discussion, because one of our members on the podium will have to leave us very soon. So we will have a very short break of 3 minutes and then reconvene for the panel discussion.
Politik fordert, aber rechtlich ist halt leider nicht alles möglich, was man sich da wünscht. Wie wird der Livestream angenommen?
Dazu habe ich noch gar keine Info. Das weiß ich vielleicht, wenn ich jetzt ja.
Ich glaube, dass die Temperaturen es uns heute schwer machen.
Ja, es ist auch die Zeit nicht ganz günstig und gegen Ende des Semesters, ja. Aber meine Güte, jetzt ist es einmal so. Und Hauptsache die Ausstellung ist einmal da und ich freue mich, dass Sie da sind und dass wir darüber diskutieren können. Und,
genau, wunderbar.
Gut, dann werden wir langsam beginnen.
Is there any specific order you want us to sit in?
You're in the center.
Do I? Well, I suppose I'm the only woman on the panel, so
Unfortunately.
it's also kind of almost like a convention now.
Yeah, well generally, taking this in terms of demography, there should be only women now here.
Well, yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, but this
Not very
is
skillful.
Unless it flips or
you can't.
flops.
You see, this is why you need to pay work as well, so that they measure what they're making. It's me preparing to talk about wages, wage-led growth for post-war recovery, as way of stabilizing humanitarian situation.
Well, I would like to talk about pensions.
Are you already qualified for pension? Because my generation in Ukraine will never have any pension. They don't need it. I mean, they won't live till pension anyway. Who cares? I mean, why do you need it if you won't survive anyway? Спасаюсь черным гумором, не знаю, уже більше, чим спасати.
Тільки вибором
А ні, це мені не треба, це... Ручка потрібна. Воно не хоче. От не хоче воно і все. Щоб воно ці стакани не... Ні, просто щоб воно... Ні, мені все одно, щоб воно стакани не поскидало. Мені...
тут немає. Ні. Може краще його взагалі зняти?
Я теж так думаю, бо як воно посеред панелі почне оце скакати, це буде взагалі ні на що не схоже. Тому я думаю, що обійдемося ми без нього. Ми ж не спагеті сідаємо їсти, я думаю, буде все буде гаразд. А ви проїздом?
Я приїхав спеціально для цього. Ми всі в цьому житті проїздили.
Ну, це теж дуже важливе справді.
Lysander, pleasure to meet you.
It's such a magnificent hall.
Yeah.
Good. Now we are
Big
waiting.
halls are very good for natural ventilation.
We are waiting for the general prosecutor. Good. You have a mic. You have a mic. Now I
Yeah.
also grab a mic.
Water.
Here is water for you.
Very much. We have about 3-5 minutes or so. Like short introduction and then discussion. It's always better to have more time for discussion.
We will start with the general prosecutor because he has to leave us in 15 minutes. So.
Yeah, then generally when you have people of that level of seniority join, it's only polite to go for it.
Well, I was trying to frame it a bit. We have a go. I didn't even know.
Indication to that.
Das war mir nicht bewusst, aber Hasen ist zerstört.
Wir haben es geschafft, dass du, wie heißt das auf Deutsch, Umschlag, 50 Millionen Säckchen aus dieser ausgestellt. Das ist 50 Millionen Tonnen.
Well, I'm just saving time. I will stay, then we'll start, I will sit.
That's a good point. We sit for a living, so...
Okay. Whatever you prefer.
No, I've already nested. I'm going to stay here, so then I can go back and forth.
Well, it's bar chairs, so if it would be something other, so I feel myself like a bar. Isn't Mr. Batalia staying next to Alfred? Do you know this person? I think he was in Kiev the head of cultural section of Austria, so he looks familiar.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Welcome back to the panel discussion, ladies and gentlemen. According to figures published by the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission to Ukraine in June, more than 11,000 civilians have been reported killed, with at least 611 children among them. More than 21,000 civilians were injured. The real figures are probably much higher, as are the losses of the Ukrainian armed forces. Moreover, civilian infrastructure has been damaged: power stations, dams, churches, museums, schools, and hospitals. Our panel now will discuss humanitarian as well as legal aspects. Let me introduce our speakers. To my right, this is Dr. Yulia Yurchenko, a senior lecturer in political economy at the University of Greenwich, England. Hopefully, Andriy Kostin will join us online. He is the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. We understand that due to other obligations, the Prosecutor General can be with us for the first round of discussion only. Welcome, Prosecutor General. Then, also to my right, Georgiy Kassianov is historian, professor at the University of Lublin, and author of Memory Crash: Politics of History in and Around Ukraine. And last but certainly not least, to my left, this is Lysander Fremuth, a lawyer and professor of fundamental and human rights at this university. Thanks to all of you for joining this panel. Unfortunately, Colonel Reisner cannot be with us. My first question goes to you, Prosecutor General. First of all, thank you very much for joining us. We know that you are a very busy man. This Monday only you stated in a press release that since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukrainian law enforcement officers have already recorded almost 130,000 cases of crimes committed by Russian soldiers, including 301 cases of sexual violence. You have undertaken the initiative to ensure domestic prosecution for war crimes as well as international accountability. So let me ask you to give us a brief update on the current state and the objective of investigations.
Thank you, Professor Mueller. Respectful members of panel and audience, it will be very difficult to make it brief, but I will try. First of all, I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this panel as part of the opening of the photo exhibition, Eyes on the War, that so well depicts Russia's assault on Ukraine and its gruesome consequences. I'm deeply grateful to the organizers of the photo exhibition as well as University of Vienna for hosting this event. I regret being unable to join in person. As the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, my goal is very clear and straightforward: ensure justice and accountability for the international crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. Each Ukrainian prosecutor feels the weight of this duty, and with every day more so as the war goes on. We do not have an easy task, particularly as the war is still ongoing and Ukrainian cities are being shelled on a daily basis. At the same time, parts of Ukrainian territories remain under Russian occupation, consequently inaccessible for documenting violation, secure evidence, witnesses, and survivors. From the early days of war, we realized that Ukraine has to act in close partnership with friends and allies, international organizations. We often call it burden sharing and hands-on support, being concerted under the intrinsic web of accountability, outlined in point 7 of Ukraine's peace formula proposed by President Zelensky. First and foremost, as you have pointed out, our aim is to ensure effective investigation of core international crimes on a national level. From the very beginning, we recognized having a primary obligation to end impunity while ensuring cooperation and partnership with international and national stakeholders. With more than 130,000 registered war crimes, 609 identified suspects, and 118 convictions in Ukrainian courts, we acknowledge that the task ahead of us will require not only years but decades of commitment. For that reason, we have strengthened our central office, War Crimes Department, that led prosecution of criminal cases from Russian invasion and occupation of Ukrainian territories in 2014. In parallel, we have invested in setting up 9 regional war crime units, along with specialized units at a central level to address conflict-related sexual violence that is being used by Russians as a method of war, war-related environmental damage, blow-up of Kakhovka Dam being one of the most vivid examples, and the unlawful transfer and deportation of over 19,000 Ukrainian children to Russian Federation. We also focus on implementation of a victim-centered approach for survivors of Russian atrocities through the Victims and Witnesses Coordination Center, established within the Office of Prosecutor General. The second pillar of our activities is securing accountability for the crime of aggression, the root of all these evils committed in Ukraine and the mother of all international crimes. My office has opened an investigation into this crime, but the national justice system is procedurally barred from prosecuting Russia's leadership, heads of state and government, in domestic courts due to their personal immunity. This gap in accountability needs to be properly addressed. We strongly believe that establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression is the only way forward. Therefore, special tribunal must be international in nature to overcome jurisdictional barriers, focusing on the manifest case of the act of aggression that followed the annexation of parts of our territory. In this regard, the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression, established in July last year in Eurojust, is a crucial first step to facilitate investigation and case building against the crime of aggression. Currently, the team of International Center of the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression is composed of Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian, Polish, and Romanian prosecutors, joined by special prosecutor from the United States and a team of the International Criminal Court. Third pillar of our web of accountability is dedicated to strategic partnership with the international justice mechanisms. Fostering effective cooperation and coordination between Ukrainian and international judicial institutions is a key to the effective and comprehensive adjudication of core international crimes. Our cooperation with the International Criminal Court is based on the principle of burden sharing. It is consistent with the spirit of the Rome Statute, as well as our obligations under 4th Geneva Conventions and its additional protocol. We are immensely grateful to the International Criminal Court and the Office of Prosecutor under Karim Khan's leadership for the momentous work undertaken, prompt initiation of investigation into the situation in Ukraine. Within a year's time, issuing of the first 2 arrest warrants against President Putin and so-called Child Commissioner of Russia for kidnapping Ukrainian children in March 2023. Those arrest warrants are both symbolic and well-timed, revealing the persecutory nature of the policy behind atrocities committed by Russia. This March, ICC has issued 2 new arrest warrants against military leadership of Russia's air and naval forces for missile strikes against Ukrainian electric and power infrastructure that left millions of Ukrainians without water, heat and electricity amidst cold winter. Again, we see that ICC is being responsive by focusing on atrocity crimes that have widespread and systematic nature. And of course, it's critically important that second arrest warrants were issued not only for war crimes, but also for crimes against humanity. Again, it's a vivid example of complementary nature of the ICC. While in first case, we are procedurally barred to prosecute Putin. In second case, unfortunately, Ukrainian criminal code does not contain crime against humanity. And the ICC is a complementary judicial mechanism to prosecute such crimes. We take the same stance in relation with other international justice mechanisms, such as UN Inquiry Commission on Ukraine, OSCE fact-finding instrument, and other special procedures. The fourth pillar of our web of accountability is dedicated to fostering bilateral and multilateral interstate partnership. And there are also exceptional efforts being undertaken at a national level by states, individually and jointly, in order to investigate and prosecute international crimes committed in Ukraine. National investigations have been opened by more than 20 states, plus by the Joint Investigation Team under the auspices of Eurojust. We already have successful examples with the suspicion notices being issued by the United States and Lithuania for the war crimes committed by members of the Russian armed forces and proxies under their control. The last pillar of accountability aims at ensuring payment of reparations to Ukraine and Ukrainian people by Russia, in line with international law. For that, the international community needs to continue the stringent sanctions regime against Russia and associated individuals and businesses. Confiscated assets should be repurposed for the rebuilding and reconstruction of Ukraine, and of course, for repayment, damage and harm to victims and survivors of Russia's aggression. In parallel, we need the international community's assistance in establishing an international compensation mechanism to satisfy reparation claims. The launching of a register of damage for gathering and preserving damages has been an important starting point in April this year. Now, the Ukrainian people are awaiting redress, and that needs to be delivered. As you can see, it is a complex and multi-layered web of accountability. It relies upon the resilience of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, and our close cooperation and partnership with our allies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prosecutor General. Thank you very much for joining us. I understand that due to other obligations, you cannot stay with us. So I believe you gave us a very impressive picture of, first of all, the size of the atrocities and the crimes that have been committed, and also the activities that your office is undertaking in order to document these crimes and also bring them to justice. I don't know whether you have 1 or 2 minutes left, and I would like to briefly ask you, beside documenting all these atrocities and hopefully sometimes bringing them to justice, how do you understand, or how do you interpret your task with regard to the Ukrainian society, Ukrainian population, making them feel that all this suffering is not simply forgotten? Is this one of the driving forces?
Thank you very much for your question. We have 10 minutes more, so I will try to cover this extremely important issue. You know, Ukraine and Ukrainians are victims of Russia's aggression, and therefore we have an undeniable right to an effective remedy. Holding Russia accountable, restoring justice, and securing reparation for the victims and survivors of the international crimes are not only prerequisites for long-lasting peace and rebuilding process for Ukraine, but also a first step towards healing of Ukrainian nation. We all know that for decades, Russia's criminal regime remained emboldened by impunity for its wars of aggression and atrocities in a number of countries, including in Ukraine in 2014. Therefore, accountability is an important deterrent measure, not only to prevent future repetition of such acts in Ukraine, but elsewhere in the world. It is the only way forward to preserve the international legal order, peace and stability. Throughout the past 3 years, the atrocity crimes are being committed by Russia in pursuance of its persecutory policy against Ukrainian nation. The concerted actions aimed at erasing our identity by kidnapping Ukrainian children from occupied territories, permanently transferring them to Russia, changing their nationality and adopting them into Russian families, torturing and ill-treating Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilians in occupied territories, subjected them to sexual violence and unlawful detention simply for being Ukrainians, destroying Ukrainian cultural monuments and archives, rewriting historic narrative and indoctrinating youth within occupied territories, shelling Ukraine's electricity infrastructure amidst freezing winter, leaving millions of civilians without water, electricity and heating, punishing civilian population merely for being a Ukrainian. These are not merely war crimes committed in the theaters of war, but deliberate assault on Ukrainian identity. Majority of offenses being crimes against humanity that could in certain episodes also amount to the crime of genocide. Therefore, for us, prosecution of these atrocity crimes give recognition to the suffering of the victims, survivors and their families, contributes to the restoration of some of the dignity and integrity that they lost or was severely damaged. Confidence and long arm of justice is an important component of moral support and response for the whole Ukrainian nation, that their grievances are heard and acknowledged, perpetrators held fully accountable, repetition of such horrendous crimes prevented, rights and dignity restored. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prosecutor General, for your explanations.
Thank you. Thank you, dear colleagues.
Thank you for joining us. Now I would like to turn to Professor Fremuth. I would like to take a step back after hearing the details about the size of atrocities and also the investigations, but also hearing why the investigations are not only important for documenting the crimes, but also as a first step to healing the wounds that have been brought to Ukrainian society. I would like to turn to you as a lawyer and ask you about the type of crimes that can be analyzed in the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Back in March 22, the international community, the United Nations General Assembly, already reached some sort of a verdict in its resolution of March 22. The General Assembly declared that the Russian war of aggression was to be condemned. It was an unlawful act, and it also called for the immediate Russian withdrawal. And later, also the International Court of Justice came to a similar conclusion. So from your perspective, what is the position of public international law with regard to the Russian war against Ukraine? And secondly, what types of violations of law can be identified?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And first of all, many thanks for the invitation to participate in this important panel. As you said, we have two dimensions. The one is the state dimension, the Russian Federation being responsible for waging a war of aggression against Ukraine, and the second dimension, the individual responsibility of perpetrators. As a public international lawyer, I dare saying that this is one of the rare clear cases, because we have sufficient evidence, we have a precise criteria for legal assessment, and as you mentioned, we have international condemnation. It was a surprise for many Western lawyers that a total number of 144 states in the General Assembly, representing the international community, voted for Ukraine against the war of aggression and asked Russia to be held accountable. Why is it a clear case? After the First, but in particular after the Second World War, public international law established a new security architecture. And one of the most fundamental norms is the prohibition of the use of force. That means in interstate relation, every act or every use of force against the territorial integrity, political independence or sovereignty of another state is prohibited. That is a clear case on the state side. When it comes to criminal responsibility, it is matched by the crime of aggression. And it's interesting to see that during the Nuremberg trials, the crimes against the peace have been the main crimes people have been accused and prosecuted for. So that is a pretty clear case, because there are only 3 exemptions under international law for the prohibition of the use of force. The one is authorization by the Security Council. Obviously, Russia was not authorized. The second is self-defense. And it's interesting to read through the presentations or the public announcement of Putin, because he tried to justify his aggression by referring to self-defense. In 2021, he published a speech, even in English published, saying that the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, is under attack by Ukraine, by the West, by NATO, and so on. The problem is that the definition of self-defense is very narrow. You need an armed attack. And there was no armed attack against Russia. So the second justification has no ground. And then there is a third justification. That is the so-called humanitarian intervention. And I think it's important to know these exemptions, because they explain why Putin argues the way he argues. And the third discussed exemption is humanitarian intervention. Public international lawyers discuss whether in case of flagrant violations of human rights, genocide, a state might unilaterally take resort to the use of force. So now we see why Putin said that a genocide is being committed in Ukraine. Because another line of argumentation has been, we are entitled to militarily intervene in Ukraine because we want to prevent genocide and punish those accountable. And you mentioned the International Court of Justice, the principal judicial order of the United Nations. In its interim measure, it still stated there is no evidence for genocide. And furthermore, it said there is strong doubts in international law whether the conception of humanitarian intervention as such is an exception to the use of force. So that is a clear case. And then we have 2 more dimensions, if you grant me another minute, from the perspective of public international law. The one is international humanitarian law and international human rights law as the third dimension. International humanitarian law is, in former times we call it the law of wars, striving for a minimum of humanity when weapons speak. Minimum of humanity. So, killing a combatant is not in general a violation of public international law. It's not a violation of the law in wars. And even civilian casualties can be justified under international humanitarian law. However, there are some fundamental principles, and we see clear violations of them. The first one, and maybe the most important principle, is the principle of distinction. You must never attack civilians if they do not actively take part in hostilities, and you must never attack civilian objects. And we see clear proof from all the inquiry missions and the reports that Russia has intentionally attacked civilians and civilian objects. Now, there is clear evidence for this. So this is the principle of distinction. Furthermore, even if you might accept civilian casualties, if there is a military advantage outweighing the loss of life. There is the prohibition of excessive use of force. And we also see that Russia has violated the prohibition of using excessive force. There is a clear norm in international humanitarian law that you must not do or conduct full-scale bombardment in areas where you have military objects and civilian objects, because then you cannot distinguish between civilians and military objects. And obviously, attacks against medical personnel, against nuclear power plant, the attack on the dam leading to massive environmental damage. It's all prohibited under humanitarian law. And finally, we have another dimension that is international human rights law. We also see that human rights have been violated in an incredible extent. We see enforced disappearance. We see sexual violence committed against women, girls, and men as a strategy of war. And actually, sexual violence has become a strategy of warfare. We have seen it in Libya, for instance. We have seen it in Afghanistan. So these are, besides torture and so on, massive violations of human rights. You ask what crimes are committed. Well, we have 4 international core crimes. They are said to violate the conscience of humankind and the interest of the international community. That is the crime of aggression, fulfilled. Problem, the International Criminal Court is not having jurisdiction. Because with regard to the crime of aggression, the court depends on the aggressor consenting to jurisdiction. And Russia is neither party nor did it consent to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. So yes, this crime has been committed, but we have no international court so far to address this crime. And there was, the Prosecutor General brought it up, the discussions about an ad hoc tribunal. I will not dwell on this, unlike you asked me to do so. The second crime, war crimes. I mentioned a few of them. War crimes are obviously committed, and Russian soldiers, but also the leaders, can be held accountable. And as touched upon, there are arrest warrants issued by the International Court of Justice against Putin, against the Commissioner for Children's Rights, and against 2 generals, though we are not sure whether one of the generals is still alive, because Ukraine said we killed him already. But that has to be proven before the court can seize this procedure. For attacking civil infrastructure and for transferring children, Ukrainian children, to Russia. And the third crime is crime against humanity. We have seen widespread and systematic attacks against civilian infrastructure, against civilians. And one of the arrest warrants issued by a pre-trial chamber of the International Criminal Court is based on, or also covers, crimes against humanity. So 3 crimes are a clear case. The 4th crime is genocide. And that has been touched upon also by the Prosecutor General. And that is a very delicate crime, because the International Court of Justice is extremely reluctant in recognizing that genocide has been committed. Genocide is composed of 2 criteria. One, objective criteria, and these objective criteria are met. Killing members of a group, transferring children from one group to the other, or imposing severe bodily or mental conditions leading to inhumane, degrading treatment, torture, you could say. This is fulfilled. But genocide also requests a genocidal intent. You must strive for the destruction of a social and ethical or religious group, in part or entirely. Listening to Russian politicians, you would easily say, well, there is at least a strong indication for a genocidal content. Putin, Medvedev, even more, has said, let's eradicate Ukraine, Ukrainian tradition, Ukrainian culture, and we also see attacks on cultural heritage, also a war crime. But the problem is that you must prove as a prosecutor that this genocidal intent is in a direct link to the objective conduct. I tend to assume that this might work, but in the end it will be courts to decide. But the more often, I would say, politicians or media in Russia say, let's eradicate Ukraine, the tradition, the history, the culture of Ukraine, the more likely it is that also courts would accept that the crime of genocide was committed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fremuth, for this comprehensive analysis. I know that the task that I gave you was perhaps enough for an entire lecture series, but you squeezed it into 10 minutes, and so you provided us the basis, or at least the basic knowledge of what we need to have for discussing humanitarian and legal issues. Now let me turn to Dr. Yurchenko. You are a specialist of Ukrainian society. So how does all this, what the Prosecutor General said before and what Mr. Fremuth said now, this multiplicity of stress of war crimes, of atrocities, at least, how does this affect Ukrainian society? What are the structures that help Ukrainian society, and how does this interplay? How does or what are the structures that help Ukrainian society also to deal with this enormous stress with a situation as it has been described before?
Thank you very much. I'll just want to start by saying thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for the Institute of Human Sciences as well, where I am now based as a fellow. So by lucky coincidence, I'm here to talk to all these our esteemed guests and panelists about the problems of Ukraine. And I'm glad that you have brought up the human dimension and the social dimension, because there are different forms of justice, and social and economic justice are also part of that. There is fundamental injustice being done to Ukrainians by this war. And one of the things that I am studying is macroeconomic policies and in-war and post-war recovery policies aimed at remedying all of those damages, and whether they are capable of delivering justice to Ukrainians who have lost their livelihoods, who have lost their loved ones, who've lost their heirlooms, who've lost children, and so much more. And of course, a lot is at stake and a lot is on the table. We've already heard a lot of numbers today, so it's easy to go after that, I suppose, of how many people are displaced, how many people have been injured, how many homes have been destroyed. I also want to bring up another number that in year 2023, 14.6 million people in Ukraine needed humanitarian aid. That's not people outside Ukraine who fled, that's inside Ukraine. That is about 40% of population. This is the state of the economy. The Kiev School of Economics conducts a big study documenting the sustained damage to infrastructure and to civilian housing, and of course the government Ministry for Economy and different institutes do similar things as well. The full scale of damage, we've already heard something to the tune of 500 billion. It will be significantly more. We do not, first of all, the war is not over. Secondly, we do not really know the scale of damage in the territories where fighting is happening and those that are occupied. We will only know those numbers after. Of course, there are certain things that cannot be calculated. You cannot calculate the value of destroyed ecosystems. There is no monetary value for those things. You cannot calculate the value of loss of human life. There is a statistical value of life, but that is a separate matter. That means nothing to somebody who lost a husband or a child. There is a very strong gender dimension to this war, of course, because of mobilization rules. Women of certain professions are subject to mobilization. The rest of women who are in the army, and it's a significantly higher proportion compared to other armies, are those who volunteer to fight. Women and elderly and children are overwhelmingly those who have fled the country, and that of course leads to additional disruption of social fabric, enforced lone parenthood, further feminization of poverty. So there are much more single mother households that are really impoverished, and they're more likely to rely on humanitarian aid and support of volunteers. There is a massive problem, of course, with housing. Ukrainian housing market is poorly regulated, and there will be a need for a large-scale state housing program. What we see, there are some programs for substitution of lost housing, but overwhelmingly the programs that are on the table are of some form of subsidized mortgages. Well, the average wage in Ukraine is monthly, less than 500 euros. A small flat in Kiev costs about 100,000 and very small on the outskirts. I don't think you need to be an economist to understand that this is not going to be sufficient. So when you have low wages, displaced population, defunding of public services, and therefore individualization of costs for medication, for after-school activities, and disruption of public transport, and very high utility bills, because Ukraine energy distribution has been privatized despite my opinion it is that it was in violation of law on privatization, because natural monopolies are still exempt from privatization under the current law, but that's again for lawyers to deliver the verdict. So when you have these kind of constraints on households, and you have this large displacement of population, and numerous people injured and dead, and we do not know how many people died in combat. Ukraine doesn't publish those numbers for, I think, understandable reasons. Then it is very difficult to envisage how the economy can be rebuilt and how socioeconomic justice can be established. Ukraine is also a heavily indebted state, and a lot of the war effort has been financed through increasing state debt. Most of the domestic public expenditure is financed through aid, and domestically raised revenue goes towards the military expenditure. But state debt is growing exponentially at very fast pace. Ukraine is actually facing a tactical debt default at this point. The privately held state debt that has been put on freeze 2 years ago in August is now being renegotiated, and it doesn't look like there will be an agreement achieved. And I hold it that Ukrainians should not have to pay for the war damage that they have been sustained. We already heard it from established diplomats and prosecutors that it should be Russia who pays for the damage, for justice to be done. It's important to document crimes, but it's also important to compensate those who have suffered unduly and unjustly all of these different losses. For that, what would be necessary, and there are a lot of high-level negotiations that are happening, is about restructuring the debt, is about macroeconomic assistance, is about investment in Ukraine and developing different sectors. How and to what extent that will materialize, we will see. At this point, at the lowest estimate, 4.6 more people will be needed as workforce units in order to support the economic effort that will support the economy in order to provide good living conditions for people. ILO published a report last autumn that established that in fact, at the most basic level scenario, 8.6 million additional labor force units will be needed to stabilize the economy. We are not even talking about wage-led growth, which is what Ukraine needs. If the wages are low, people who left the country won't come back. That is a simple fact. And if you don't have people to execute your plans remain plans, and the economy doesn't develop. And for people to come back, what you need is a socio-economic system of services, state housing program, fiscal expansion and funding of public services, creation of jobs in healthcare and education that are low carbon and are needed already. Free women who are now productively immobilized by increased care responsibilities so that they can actually participate in paid work rather than looking after children and elderly because they have no one to leave kids with. So there are creative solutions to these complex problems that can give Ukrainians an idea that the Ukraine they are fighting for and are trying to save can be built. So that is not slogans, but it is a reality. And all they need is to be scaffolded in their efforts of their famous resilience. But resilience is not an unlimited resource. It is something that needs to be supplemented. People do break and they do die, and there are a lot of excess deaths from strokes and heart attacks and cancers that will be incalculable, of course. So for that, there are economic models that show that in other situations for low and middle income countries, that actually it's not fiscal shrinkage, so budgetary shrinkage, but expansion that pays for itself within the same year, creates conditions and gives people hope to come back and build societies, and stabilizes what is known as social ills, which is juvenile delinquency and petty crime and all of that kind of thing. So I think a lot is being done, a lot more could be done, and fundamentally, if the central value of rebuilding efforts and of the matters of establishing justice after victory of Ukraine is, if people and nature are those fundamental aims, restoration, natural balance, putting Ukrainians at the center of recovery, all those who call Ukraine a home, not just those who are Ukrainian citizens or of Ukrainian ethnicity, but everybody who calls Ukraine a home, then rebuilding can happen, socioeconomic justice can happen, and those who have given the ultimate of sacrifice can feel finally vindicated. And only after that we can be talking about a lasting peace and about some form of truth and reconciliation in further future. It's hard to envisage now, but we need to understand that that should be the final aim. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this highly differentiated picture. On the one hand, showing the dimension of problems and also some figures that are going to be needed to rebuild the country, and on the other hand also giving a hopeful outlook that in fact Ukraine can be rebuilt better, to use a political slogan, and you also pointed to some of the possibilities of how to do it. Now, let me turn to the second historian in our gathering, to Professor Kassianov. One of the greatest surprises to many people in Western societies was actually the resilience of the Ukrainian people, resilience that has been mentioned repeatedly today and only just now by Emil. What would be your interpretation from the historical perspective? Where does this tremendous resilience come from? In this war, we have very often, and Mr. Fremuth already pointed to it, being confronted with the distortion of historical facts by the aggressor. But on the other hand, there are some historical facts that perhaps may help to explain the resilience of the Ukrainian people and also put this into a perspective, a larger historical perspective, this Ukrainian struggle and to defend the country and society. So what is your historical perspective on this?
Might be several points might be made regarding this. First of all, history as such in this kind of performance performed by Putin and the environment and even by the broader circles is that history is quite toxic in terms of understanding and interpreting. The second point is that, Putin started this war definitely because he's not good in history, and he's not good in Ukrainian history. So probably if he would be more informed, probably he would think twice before starting this. In many cases, it looks like an absolute absurd, like absolute irrational choice to do this, to start this war. So, but if you would get a bit deeper into this kind of motivation and reasoning behind these decisions and talking about history, the major problem here is that Putin, and not just Putin, if you look at Russian society at whole, you will see the same picture. He does not recognize, not rationally, he does not recognize it at any level of consciousness, of subconsciousness. He does not recognize Ukrainians as a separate people, exactly because he's not good in history. Should he learn Ukrainian history more? Probably Mr. Medinsky, who wrote this, the basis for his article about historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, probably in this case, his understanding would be very different. And this is very, well, in fact, he brings us, and the whole situation brings us to this Hegelian world of historical and non-historical nations. And definitely Russians believe that Ukrainians are a non-historical nation. Why? Because for some time they didn't have their statehood. This is exactly a Hegelian understanding of history and historical and non-historical nations. So, and for him, Russians are historical nation. And then third point here is that Ukrainians are part of bigger bigger Russian people. So they are not separate. They do not have separate identity. They have some, some specificity, but they are not different. They are us. They're part of historical Russian body, historical Russian culture, etc., etc. So this makes possible making wrong decisions, tragic decisions for Ukrainians, and in longer perspective for Russians. Because this war is also harming Russia, and well, if we look through this from historical perspective, you can find a lot of other examples when starting this kind of war just ended with some kind of catastrophe for initiators. But nevertheless, going back to this, the peculiarity of Ukrainian history. Yes, it's true, Ukrainian statehood at different stages of Ukrainian history, well, the statehood, there were breaks in statehood, or we can say that, well, sometimes Ukrainians, well, many times Ukrainians did not have their own state and lived under foreign dominance or just composed the population of other countries or empires in this case. So, what happened? So Putin decided, and people around him decided that, well, these people do not have state tradition. This state is for a long time, I think that story started in 2010s, when certain analytical groups in the West started to consider Ukraine state as a failed state. And then in 2019, there was a famous Gallup opinion poll which showed that only 9% of Ukrainians believe their state institution, trust in their state institutions. So there was a lot of factors and considerations which made them sure that Ukraine would not stand. And then I think it would not be a great secret that, well, not just in Russia, but in the West, a lot of people who do analysis believe that Ukraine would not stay more than 3 days or 7 days or a month, etc., and that it will disappear. And then something happened. What happened? What Putin and his guys cannot take into account is that Ukraine has a certain specificity which is about society, about what we can, in very broad terms, call civil society. I don't speak here about civil society created through Western funding, through different structures which represented Western point of view, Western technologist, Western understanding of democracy, etc., in Ukraine. No, I speak about grassroots society. If you look at what happened in Ukraine after the first act of aggression, after 2014, you would see that the rise of the phenomena which called voluntary movement. Yeah? That's exactly about extensive structures which never registered anywhere. They are not in the register of Ministry of Justice, where all civil society organizations should be registered. No, there is tens of thousands of informal structures, which, if you look at Ukraine history, existed not just after '91. They existed for much longer time. Here we can speak about longue durée, about hundreds of years, when people of certain territory, which is now Ukraine, a Ukrainian state, lived for centuries as self-organizing entities, as horizontal structures, which overlived a lot empires and other states, occupiers, etc., etc. So this is the major that was the major mistake, great mistake, grave mistake, which was done, and this mistake was based on a wrong understanding of history. And this is why these are the roots of Ukrainian resilience. So anyway, another point is that they do not know history in other cases, because I don't know how people should consider their actions if they believe that it is possible to take such a huge territory. And of course they were thinking about coup d'etat, something like this, just replacing the government, etc. But once again, they do not understand Ukrainian history. Ukrainians never accepted the government brought by some other force. En masse, of course. Of course, there are always collaborators, etc., as in every nation. But in this case, once again, they do not know history. Why then don't know history? It's easy. If you look at, we did research in 21. We observed Russian textbooks, school textbooks. There is no Ukraine there at all. Ukraine emerges only after '91 as a state unit, but once again, the interpretations are, well, let's say, put it mildly, very, well, not correct. So, well, it's understandable. The only problem here, not just with Russia, I would like to put it in a broader perspective. We also observed textbooks of Western countries, Poland, France, United Kingdom, Germany, and we also didn't find Ukraine there. This is one of the, probably one of explanations why the West was so slow in promoting the support for Ukraine. Or if you look at transatlantic connection, then if you look, well, definitely it's not the matter of national textbooks, history textbooks to write about other countries, but at the level of academic historiography. In the Western, in Northern America, well, it took about 60 years to bring knowledge there about Ukraine and to convince them that it is legal, that Ukraine as a nation is legal, that it has historical legacy. So it's not just Russia which started this war, it's not just Putin and probably a great deal of his population, it's much more, it's global. Misunderstanding and lack of knowledge about Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine should also take part of guilt for this, for not promoting Ukrainian case through 30 years of independence. But it's another part of story, particularly now when Ukraine is in the war. And final point about this, about history, I will finish now, is that, well, it's about Russia itself. They also have this very toxic understanding of their own history, and which is based on the idea of, now it is formulated as a Russian unique civilization. I know one country which based its ideology on uniqueness of civilization, of uniqueness of the past. It was Germany. Sonderweg, it's German word. So you know what happened to this. Of course, I don't like analogies, but it's just a historical example. Russia now professes absolutely the same line. This Russian civilization, which does not belong neither to the West nor to the East, is very specific, and therefore this civilization has special mission in the world. So, that's it.
Thank you very much, Georgiy Kassianov, particularly for pointing to the traditions of horizontal organization of Ukrainian society, no matter which empire currently was trying to rule over the territory, and also for comparatively analyzing the use of history from the Russian perspective, but also the lack of knowledge that was very widespread in Western society. This is certainly one of the tragic aspects of this current war, that obviously this war was needed to make many people in Western societies aware of the existence, the very existence and the distinctiveness of Ukrainian history, culture and society. Now let me briefly come back to Ms. Yurchenko with regard to the changes and the reconstruction of Ukrainian society as you sketched it before, what contributions can be made from history, and also what legal preconditions, what economic preconditions you consider necessary for reaching a better Ukraine in the future, is something that many people are fighting for.
Thank you very much. It's a very important and a very big question. And there are indeed many examples in history from post-war rebuildings, but also post-catastrophe rebuildings. We have ecocide, we have chemical contamination, large-scale destruction on unprecedented scale, all happening at the same time. And I need to remind people that also COVID still does exist. It didn't quite finish, even though people have other concerns, but that didn't go away. So what kind of preconditions exist there? So first of all, of course, there is a lot of efforts on rebuilding that are already on the way, from planning to actual physical rebuilding of roads, of buildings, schools. We've heard about the bomb shelters, of course, and the sheltered school in Kharkiv, which in itself is a harrowing reality that you need to build underground schools. But the rebuilding planning that was first presented in Lugano 2 years ago at a big conference, and now there's been 3 of those conferences so far. And the last year was in London, this year was in Berlin just last week, and I was there. And we had with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, a pre-conference event, and of course I met with a lot of people who were at the official event. And the planning generally, as it was presented 2 years ago, was split into 3 phases. The liquidation phase, liquidation of damage, and that initially was planned for 2 years, but we see that that's not quite materialized. But time frames at this point are something else. So there is liquidation, then there is short-term rebuilding and long-term planning, right, which seems prudent and makes sense. So liquidation of immediate damage, then immediate short-term needs of re-establishing, for example, broken infrastructure, supporting small and medium enterprises, coordinating industrial, small and medium enterprises, local economy efforts. There are excellent objectives of that big Lugano plan of a couple of 1,000 pages, and they pertain to smart economy, digitization, gender equality, sustainability, all the things that we like to hear. When I look at the means on the table, I'm a little bit more skeptical, and I've already mentioned some of them. So first of all, Ukraine is heavily indebted, and we know from post-Second World War, for example, rebuilding, which was the next comparable by scale disaster we can remember, is that a lot of rebuilding, including through Marshall Plan, happened through debt relief and through grants rather than loans, and through a lot of direct cash payments and transfer of goods, from medication to grain to cash transfers to households. If you do not increase household purchasing capacity, local economy is dying. Small and medium enterprises in Ukraine are already suffering a lot. Many of them have relocated to what is considered more peaceful areas like Vinica, where my family is from. That's closer to the border with Moldova. Looking with worry on Transnistria, but let's hope that doesn't blow up. So some businesses that were slightly less damaged and they had some liquidity and they had some resources to apply for some grants are doing a bit better. The rest are suffering quite a bit because domestic market is disrupted. Purchasing capacity of households has been significantly diminished. One of the things that very often this doesn't get talked about in the macroeconomic recovery planning is the role of this civil society, donations and free labor that supports the war effort, and the role of remittances in Ukrainian economy. At the beginning of the war, remittances from Ukrainians who work abroad constituted 10% of GDP. It was the largest by volume proportion of economic assistance from own population in the whole region. We're talking the whole post-Soviet region. That is extremely significant. Right? We look at cases like Serbia, where remittances exceed FDI so many years after the war. And if the situation domestically doesn't stabilize and people don't come back, we really want to avoid that kind of scenario, right? There is only so much you can do on pure patriotism if you have young children and you're choosing where they can and where they can't have a future, where they can build a career and can build a family. And we shouldn't judge people for those individual choices. If somebody ended up in France or in Austria and they see that there are good public services, there is clean drinking water, there is decent housing, public transportation, chances to build a career and have stability, then your heart here and versus your material conditions can dictate choices that so many generations of Ukrainians made before. And we need to remember that Russian aggression, not only Russian, but overwhelmingly Russian aggression, has expelled Ukrainians from their land for generations. We should not let this happen again. And I think through international coordinated effort and support has been overwhelming. That can be achieved. But we need to learn what was the good and the bad and what worked and didn't in previous crises. And what we know from more recent crises, which is pandemic management. We know that even in the well-to-do economies of the European Union, the rules of EU rules of fiscal compact have been relaxed, and governments were allowed to go directly borrow in capital markets to support households and businesses. Because when the economy is in a free fall, because the economy is paralyzed by pandemic or war, normal market relations don't function, and markets and companies fail even at peacetime. Ukraine is trying to do neoliberalism accelerated during wartime. This is not something that we have seen before, right? And they're managing a lot on this free labor, right? Remittances that have been shrinking and donations that we do not know full extent of because not everything can be tracked. And the direct purchase of drones and spiders and tourniquets and everything else, those are already shrinking. And if that gap is not compensated in the state budget planning, that's not there. And that means that the war effort is weakened, right? And if we don't have the victory, and if there isn't a lasting peace, if there isn't assurance that the war can't start at any point, no foreign investor will go into the country. You don't need to be an investor to know that. You don't start building factories where bombs are falling. No insurance will make it work. Right? It just simply doesn't make sense. So the war needs to be over, and then some debt restructuring, debt write-off needs to happen. Russia must pay for the damage, I understand that it is a big ask to ask the whole world to rebuild Ukraine. Everybody has their own problems. We have to be realistic. There is a cost of living crisis, all sorts of different problems in different places, and far right is on the rise, not least because of that. But it's Russia's fault and they must pay. We hear this rhetoric that, oh, you know what, we shouldn't punish Russia too much because they may act up. Remember what happened to Germany. Well, they've already done that, first of all. Secondly, now Germany blocked sanctions on Russian gas, which is one of the major sources of war financing. Ukraine's contract on the gas transportation for Russia is about to expire this year, and I have a suspicion that Ukraine will be pushed to extend that, and we shouldn't allow that to happen. So I invite you all to campaign about that with me, and campaign about writing off of Ukrainian debt, because Ukrainians and their future generations shouldn't pay through debt with interest for the damage that Russia did. It is simply morally absurd, and economically it's not going to happen. It's simply, Ukraine cannot generate enough revenue to pay for those things. So morally and economically, those things are not prudent. But if we learn from the good examples, if we learn that there should be fiscal expansion, and this I really stress that, there needs to be more funding on public services, on education, on arts, creation of jobs, and wage growth. If there is no wage growth, there is no purchasing capacity. There is no local economy. There is no small medium enterprise expansion. But if you have those conditions, I think growth can happen. And Ukrainians see the signal that they are at the center of recovery. And in this year's Berlin conference, whole of society approach was firmly on the agenda. But it needs to be backed up by firm macroeconomic policy and finance allocation. And I look forward to seeing that happen. That's where I'm looking for hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much for also bringing the economy into the picture. We have some time left, and I would like to open up the discussion also to the audience and take a couple of questions. We have a microphone here, so if you want to ask a question or make a statement, either to the entire debate or to one of the panelists, then please feel free to do so. While the mic is walking around, I want to ask another question to Professor Fremuth. Now the issue of money has been brought up, and quite recently a decision has been taken by the G7 about the use of frozen assets, or rather well, not the frozen assets themselves. So it's the revenues that are being used. So what is the legal situation in that regard?
If you grant me the chance to briefly comment on the presentations, just very briefly.
Oh, yes, please.
You mentioned ecocide. There is an interesting debate whether ecocide could become a distinct crime under international law. However, what many people don't know, it is already prohibited to provoke massive damage to the environment, and it can be prosecuted even as a crime by individuals. And if I may briefly comment on you, it was highly insightful to learn why Putin got it wrong. But I think from a legal perspective, it's very important to stress that the bizarre assumptions of Putin's play no role for the legal assessment. Because the idea of empires is over, even though we currently see that powerful states try to reactivate what Schmidt called the Großraumdenken. So I think it's very important to stand up as lawyers and say there is no justification for the forceful change of borders. No empire idea, no historic title, nothing like this. The question of money. I think now I'll be the how Emil Brix called it, the cool-headed, though not cold-blooded analyst, and I think it's the fate of lawyers to have concerns where politicians or broad public ask for swift and harsh response. It's not easy. The good thing is we have the registry of the Council of Europe for public and private damages, and also because you mentioned how much worth is a life, including the loss of life. Now we have this registry, but the problem is, in the past when these mechanisms had been established, we had either consent, which is not very likely because it's most often a result of a defeat, or the Security Council. not always acting under Chapter 7, but pushing this. And due to Russia's position as a permanent member and the right to veto, the Security Council obviously is not an option. Next good news, Russia under international law is responsible to pay compensation. That is customary international law, no doubts. If you are responsible for an international wrongful act, you have to wipe out all the consequences, you have to pay. So the question is how to force Russia to pay. And it's important to differentiate between the frozen assets on the one hand and the interests or the fruits out of these assets. Initially, there have been many politicians saying, well, let's transfer the assets to Ukraine. That is a problem and most likely a violation of public international law, because due to the principle of sovereign equality, and that is still a core principle of public international law, your public assets are safe. Some call it immunity. You better argue that this is inviolability. So you need a justification if you touch upon these assets. And we have some justifications, in particular 3. The one is countermeasures. The international community has an interest in Russia stopping the war. So the international community is entitled to break international law to force Russia to comply with international law. Another argument is to ensure compliance with international rulings. And we have the already mentioned rulings by the International Court of Justice. Ceasefire, suspend the war. And the third argument is self-defense. Ukraine is entitled to self-defense. The entire world can support Ukraine in self-defense. And there are some, I would say, very convincing arguments saying self-defense must not be the use of force, or can, besides the use of force, also mean non-forceful measures. So, in general, freezing of assets is fine. But all of these justifications, and I mentioned only 3 of them, there are quite a couple of more justifications discussed, are of temporary nature. They have no punitive character, which means they are legitimate and legal as long as Russia does not comply with its obligations. But if you transfer the money, it's gone. That would not be a temporary measure, but it would be a final measure. So we see a shift in public statements of high-ranking politicians saying, okay, let's keep the assets frozen and let's confine ourselves to get the interest, as the G7 called it, extraordinary revenues from the money. And that might work, but again, I'm just a lawyer having lots of concerns in my mind, and I'm not alone. The Parliamentary Research Service of the European Parliament said it's problematic because if you own the asset, why don't you own the benefits of the assets? So that is the first obstacle to overcome. And then we see Belgium, who has been very innovative in a sense, because they put a tax on the interest out of the frozen assets, which seems suitable in general. But again, wouldn't that be a contradiction? Because if you freeze the assets, what happens if the interest rate goes up? You take your money back. Russia is banned from taking back the money because it's frozen. And now if you tax it, I would say it's wonderful, but if you tax it to 100%, de facto this would be a confiscation. I'm not saying that public international law entirely rules out the ability to take this money and somehow give it Ukraine for the damage caused by Russia. But there are many, many arguments against under public international law, and I think that's why politicians have become very reluctant in arguing this direction. So first, and I'm very sorry as a peace-loving person to say this, first Ukraine has to win the war. Ukraine has to win the war. And afterwards, as part of negotiations with Russia, we can find a solution who pays the damage. And that is, I say, a certain type of truth, which in your initial speech you mentioned it, and also Rector Schütze mentioned it, runs counter to the understanding we had in the last century of establishing a peaceful order. But if somebody breaks the peace, we have to be resilient including the use of military force, and defeat the enemy.
Thank you very much for these points. I cannot, or I would not more agree with what you said with regard to historical justifications. That's a question that's also very often posed to me. What is it about this inexistent tradition of Ukrainian statehood? And is it true or is it not true? And even if it were true, it would not justify any war. And I think that's a very, very important point. May I take the question from the audience first? Yeah, there was one sentence, and then there is the question from the audience.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor, because what you finished with was exactly on my mind as you were speaking, that, you know, these creative legal solutions, the only way you can make the aggressor pay is to make them lose first. Because before that, there are no mechanisms really to impose a punishment. And we also know that from the Second World War. Germany didn't pay because they felt like it. It's because they were made to. They lost the war. What will get us there and how it will look is for us to see. And I get asked that question quite frequently. But it will need to be something that will be understood by Russia as a defeat. So they would accept the fact that they need to be compensating. And for that, at the very least, Ukraine should be allowed to destroy military targets inside Russia, which it still isn't, largely speaking. This is a war where Ukraine is only allowed to destroy its own territory with weapons that it gets from abroad. How scholars of war will define it at some point in the future, let's leave it for after the recorded part. But that is fundamentally strange, shall we say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, finally, we have one question. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you for this very fruitful discussion, I would say. I have actually two questions. They sort of tie together to what was just mentioned now at the end. The first one maybe is a bit more easier to answer. Both are in regards to the prosecutions of crimes, of war crimes. So first of all, we heard already that the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, they all support Ukrainian investigations and that hopefully lead to prosecution. Are there any initiatives on behalf of Austria that we could also support Ukraine somehow in the investigation with personnel, with money, expertise, experts, whatsoever? And the second question actually is how? How will we get, how would this prosecution look like? We've just heard, okay, the war has to be won by Ukraine. But what then? I mean, we see already such a widespread issue of propaganda within Russia. The Russian opposition is, I would consider it to be almost non-existent. So even if there is a leadership, a change in leadership in Russia, for example, how do we prosecute individuals? How do we prosecute people in power, people responsible? You as experts, how do you envision this? There was lots of talk, yes, we need to do it. I obviously wholeheartedly agree. Russia needs to pay, needs to be held accountable in front of courts. But how? What are concrete steps? How could it look like, you know? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who wants to? It's a lawyer's question. Yeah, it's a lawyer's question. Very good.
I try to be very brief. The question of prosecuting high-ranking officials. Well, first, after a regime change, the Russian Federation could prosecute those responsible for the war. Not sure how likely this is. Second, other domestic courts, including Austria, not so much because our criminal court is very narrow, but for instance, the Germans have a very, very broad criminal court, including universal jurisdiction. They could also try them, but the problem is incumbent head of states, presidents are protected by immunity. So as long as Putin is in office, no other domestic court could actually exercise criminal jurisdiction over him, including the foreign minister. But when we talk about soldiers, and there are proceedings in many, many states, domestic jurisdictions, for war crimes, so below the status of a foreign minister or president, head of state, people can be accused and prosecuted by domestic court in other states. And third, we have the international dimension. We have the arrest warrant issued against Putin. And there is a bit of a debate, again a debate, but I beg your pardon, I'm a lawyer, there is a bit of a debate whether heads of state or presidents are protected by immunity from international criminal prosecution. The main understanding in academia and among the courts is no. That would mean Putin could be brought to justice before the International Court of Justice, even while in office. And there is a judgment of the International Court of Justice saying, well, there is immunity in general, but not if brought before an international court. But as you know, if there are lawyers, there are a huge array of opposing opinions, so some say it's not as clear, but that's how it could work. In practice, what is the impact of the arrest warrant? I mean, we already see that Putin has to change its travel itinerary. He is no longer able traveling to Armenia because Armenia has become state party to the International Criminal Court. He did not travel to South Africa where the Brix meeting took place. So it is having an impact. And exactly as you said, we can only hope for a regime change, and that can happen. We had an arrest warrant against al-Bashir, the Sudan leader, and he felt safe for years. And then there was a regime change. And his own people arrested him and promised, I mean, we're waiting for 2 years now, and promised to extradite him to The Hague for trial. So what is the advantage of an arrest warrant? Well, as a leader, you have no longer an absolute guarantee that you will not have to stand trial. It's not super much, but it's a bit of an advancement. And you haven't, we talked about history. History is making its own judgments. You are in a row with the perpetrators of the Second World War standing trial in Nuremberg and Tokyo. You're in a row with Milosevic, who was brought to justice, with al-Bashir, people like this. So I would say that even though it's difficult to actually enforce the arrest warrant and bring him to trial, there is a huge step, it's a huge step forward. You can discuss from a political perspective whether it makes sense to issue this arrest warrant now, because some say it could be detrimental to the negotiation of peace. And the prosecutor before the International Court of Justice has a clause saying it has to be in the interest of justice. So some people say it could have been better not to issue the arrest warrant now to give peace a chance. But honestly, how likely is it that the arrest warrant is having an impact? I'm highly doubtful. The question with regard to Austria, well, actually there is a strong cooperation also within the European Union to support Ukraine when it comes to evidence, to equip the prosecutors in Ukraine to use this evidence. And the general prosecutor said it, there are over 130,000 investigations related to war crimes. But Austria as a forum for war crime trials is not very likely, because our law is very, very narrow in granting jurisdiction on Austrian prosecutors and judges to decide upon these cases. But in other states, that will be possible.
Thank you very much. Just another very brief. Would a trial in absentia be possible in, with regard to the Russian president?
Well, we had one court, that was the Sierra Leone court, that provided for trials in absentia. In general, trials in absentia, trials where the accused person is not present, are not allowed under the Rome Statute, the statute establishing the ICC. But there was a judgment saying if a person voluntarily does not show up, even though he or she has been notified that there is a proceeding against him or her, we can proceed. But this judgment is highly questionable, to be honest, because the statute of the International Court is saying you have to be present. So that means if Putin does not show up, a trial in absentia would not be possible, irrespective of the questions of immunity and final enforcement.
Thank you very much. I have now four more questions. Yes, I request you to be brief in the questions. Yes, please, Ms. Vasyl.
Yes, my name is Sonja Plesl. I have a question concerning history and remembrance. Could you please tell me if in Ukraine the European Day of Remembrance for the victims of totalitarian and authoritarian regimes, the 23rd of August, is celebrated and is known, because it is not in Austria, it is a dead day in Austria. And by asking you this, I would invite you all to come to our event, the 27th of June, in the museum, Bezirksmuseum Neubau, with Professor Wolfgang Mueller, Oksana Stavro, Konstantin Kaiser, and myself and Dietmar Pichler, where we discuss the new orientation of the culture of remembrance in Austria towards the common European understanding, towards recognizing the crimes of the Soviets and the Russian Federation and the Holodomor and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We may take a second question. Yes, please.
Hello. Thank you very much for the discussion. I would actually have a question from a similar sphere. It's also related to memory making. And as we see, I mean, the video that we saw also, how it was made, it struck me somehow that it's made with the use of drones. I mean, not the same drones, but the kind of drones that also are used for dropping missiles, also bombs on Ukrainian cities. And as Susan Sontag was writing, how much the photography, the technology development in the photography has changed our perception, understanding, imagining of the war. I would like to hear your opinion on how the modern memory making is being changed with the most probably the photo exhibitions, the films, yeah, the Oscar that we have got, the Ukrainian directors and so on. So how is it changing? What is it bringing with itself? Not only the strategy of the war that is changing, how the strategy of memory making is developing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I take the last questions, both in the second row. From the middle, yeah.
Thank you for being with us today. My name is Rostislav Futalo. I have many questions. I will ask one. Legal UN, and we see the UN's incapability to address the war properly. Any chances that in the nearest future, at least, that we still can see it being alive, UN will exclude the violator of basic international laws, like aggressor state, from veto right? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now the last question.
Thank you very much. Krauchenberg. I have just a very short question. As the statehood of Ukraine was described, and in that connection, the language issue. There were, of course, elections when we think back, Yanukovych and before, there was an East-West divide in Ukraine. But how come that Russia misinterpreted the situation completely? Because the Russian-speaking Ukrainians are still Ukrainians. Whenever you ask a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, he would say he is a Ukrainian, and obviously in Russia it was misinterpreted. And how was that possible? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now let us start with the questions regarding the Day of Remembrance in Ukraine. Who wants to comment on that?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, it's this date is in the official calendar of the dates which should be somehow at official level should be publicized. So this day is accepted. Of course, it's you know that it's quite young memorial date. It was introduced very recently. And there was a period in Ukrainian history since 2010 to 2013, 14, when there was well, the politics of memory was let's say, Soviet nostalgic, so that date was not much popular among ruling elites. But now, after Ukraine completed at least this official decommunization process, which started in 2015, this date is an official calendar. I can also connect this to memory. Yeah, that's definitely we are now just going through the process of reconsideration of the concept of memory. Of course, there is a classical now it's classical definition that there is a communicative memory which lives for 3 generations. But comparing to previous periods, we now have with this development of technologies, we have absolutely different, qualitatively new situation when you can collect collective memory, which previously was just memory of generations, which were transferred from generation to generation. Now we have this memory external. It lives beyond us, beyond our brains, even beyond our physical nodes. It lives in kilobytes, tetrabytes, in pixels, not uniform, but pixels as a visual images. It changes the concept of memory altogether. And we are in the process, which means that now I can give you only these remarks taken intuitively. There is even no methodology how to work with this. There is no methodology. There is oral history, for instance, methodology, which is already developed, etc., etc. But, for instance, there are projects which accumulated already more than 100,000 oral testimonies. Can you imagine how can you work with this? Ask artificial intellect? Probably, at a certain point. But anyway, it is a huge shift when our memory goes to containers which were never exist before. It's also, by the way, the problem of sustainability, because all these containers, these super servers, etc., they exist somewhere. In the case of physical extermination, the memory also will be exterminated. So it's a real great problem. It is not just a scientific problem, it's not scholarly problem. In fact, it is a civilizational problem. It's the problem of development of human civilization. And Ukraine, unfortunately, now at the top of dealing with this problem, because Ukraine experiences what it experiences now. May I have also made one remark about just, you know, I've taken part in these discussions since 2014, when the Russian aggression started. And I always has a sense, I'm honestly speaking, I'm very sensitive semantically. So the construction of discourse is very important. What I feel sometimes, you speak as a lawyer, that's great. But I had a sense that when you say Ukraine has to win, I have a sense that it is us, the Euro-Atlantic community has to win, and not just Ukraine. Ukraine should not be alone. Ukraine should not be perceived as some country which fights with this Leviathan, and then we should help somehow. So they are still others. No, the Ukrainians are not others to Europe. The western border of Europe, not in Poland. It is in Chasov Yar now. It is near to Kherson. This is the western border which should be defended together, not by Ukraine itself. Of course, I understand there is a lot of aid, there is a lot of military aid, etc., etc., but the way of thinking that we should somehow to understand it's not Ukraine fighting this war. It is the whole community which is around this. And it's about 50 countries now.
Thank you very much for this particularly important comment. I would love to take this as a final word, but we still have some questions to answer and some 5 minutes to go. So,
okay, I'm going to combine all of them in a quick response. So, I think, and also in response to your final comments, I think history teaches us a lot of different things. It also teaches us not only what worked, but also what didn't work, and sometimes new challenges emerge and they require different solutions. There is such a thing as setting a precedent in law. Law didn't grow on trees. It was developed by people, and rules were developed by people in order to face new challenges. In terms of bringing Russia to justice, I agree that there needs to be a victory, and the whole world should help Ukraine win instead of drip-feeding arms like it was up until now. And an international tribunal needs to be set up, and for that perhaps some new rules need to be created. Because for the first time, the permanent member of Security Council will be on trial, who actually was never elected to that permanent council. We need to also remember that Russia is an illegitimate member of the UN. They inherited the USSR seat that they didn't have a right to inherit. The whole world accepted the equality sign between Russian Empire, USSR, and Russia again. Under which kind of magic conditions? I think it's for some soul-searching of individuals and leaders. But that is an abomination that needs to be dealt with. The fact that the fact that aggressors have veto power is something that has to be abolished altogether. Generally, the UN as an institution, if it is to survive, needs to be democratized. There needs to be not just the removal of veto powers of those who commit aggression, but removal of voting powers. Temporarily suspension, they need to remain members because dialogue needs to continue, but there needs to be suspension of voting rights. How can somebody whose aggression is being judged is voting on that? That is an absurd. So there needs to be a serious revision of international rules. Holocaust is remembered in Ukraine, and there are Holocaust memorials and victims of totalitarian regime memorials that were before the official Memorial Day. They have been around the place. I was born in '82, and some of them existed then already, and more of them were built later. So that is not something that no one knows about. That actually is. There is a big memorial in Kiev, in Babin Yar, for example, and many, many more in Ukraine. And there is a lot of work being done on rectifying lies in history books that have been put there by USSR. Memory is being created, and a lot is being documented. And I encourage everybody to check out the newly launched Institute of Documenting the War called Index. It was just previous weeks that it was launched in Lviv. Ukrainian war is actually the most documented war in history. And that does change how we remember things and how we do things. It actually helps those who went through the trauma of war remember what was happening to them as it was recorded, because you do tend to black certain things out when you're in the state of trauma. So there is, I don't think we will answer all of that here because we don't quite have the time, but the East-West divide is the final thing I will say. I think if Putin wasn't allowed to get away with taking Crimea, first of all, this war wouldn't happen. If Chechnya was dealt with as it should have been dealt with, we wouldn't be here. But also if some other permanent Security Council members haven't gone against the UN before, have created precedents for Nebenzia to sit there with an impudent face and grin, we also would be looking at a slightly more orderly international order. So there's a lot of work to be done for diplomats. There is a lot of work done internationally, but Ukraine cannot be allowed to be alone, and Ukraine cannot be allowed to succumb anything to Russia, but only to win, because here the international order is at stake. It's not just about Ukraine or Ukrainians. It's about whether we're looking at competing fascistic blocs internationally who don't have any rules to go by, or we actually have a reestablishment of order. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, towards my colleague, I guess we're both sensitive related to wording and language, but from different perspectives and disciplines. So saying Ukraine has to win the war is actually a response to Russian attempts to get NATO involved. NATO could be involved, but so far it is not involved as a party to the conflict. Politically speaking, we have no disagreement. Yeah, the victory of Ukraine would be a victory of the free world, of a liberal rule of law-based democracy. Your question, and you also touched upon this, I think that the Russian war of aggression is showing that the United Nations strongly deserves reforms. But I'm always saying, to succeed in reforming the United Nations, you would have to re-establish a newly founded. Because the problem is that Russia, as you mentioned, is a permanent member of the Security Council, at the strongest organ, the one with endowed with executive competencies. So a real and effective response to any war of aggression without the Security Council is not possible. And there is an interesting aspect. The Charter of the United Nations is saying if you are involved, you should abstain from voting. And I mean, as aggressor, Russia obviously is involved. But this clause in the United Nations Charter has never been activated because it's a political decision. And there are many attempts, and I can send you an article I wrote with a colleague of mine on how to restrict the veto powers in such conflicts. It's a nice exercise of academic value, best case, but it's not having practical impact on the current situation. However, two aspects. First, the United Nations General Assembly has been very strong in condemning the war of aggression. That is a clear signal by the international community towards Russia. Plus, you mentioned this tribunal. It's not easy to establish an ad hoc tribunal to try Putin because of the act of aggression. But one important element would be to have the General Assembly on board, speaking on behalf of the international community in times where the Security Council, who could establish such a tribunal, is inactive. So that could work. And last comment, when I speak to friends in the Global South, I lived in several African countries and so on, smart people, I sometimes, and that is catching up with you, say, well, but this is a European thing. Why should we get involved? We have so many conflicts on the African continent. And you were not so much interested in our conflict. So why should we care now? One response is it is a defense of the free world, but we have to face the situation that the number of democracies and rule of law abiding states is on decline. And second, I think the conference in Switzerland last weekend, not producing much of an outcome, was extremely important to get the global South on board. Because only support by Europe or the United States might short-term help Ukraine, but in the long term, to adequately respond to aggressors such as Putin and the Russian Federation needs a combined and uniform approach by the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, our time has expired. Our discussion has dealt with legal and humanitarian and also economic and historical aspects of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. The exhibit that has been inaugurated today will be on display for 2 weeks until end of the month here on the first floor of the main building of the university. Let me first thank all speakers and all people who have been instrumental in bringing this exhibit here to Vienna. First and foremost, the Office of the President of Ukraine, the Ukrainian-Austrian Association, and also the University of Vienna. I thank all of them, and last but not least, I also thank you for joining us and for contributing to the discussion. It is the exhibit's aim to enable us to look into the eyes of the Ukrainian people defending freedom and sovereignty, not only for themselves, as has been argued here on this panel. Let us not turn our eyes away from them. Thank you very much. All best for you, and stay with us. Goodbye.
Thank you for having us here. This was a great panel. Thank you.